Okay, this is my critical analysis synthesis by Elena. My topic is differential criminalization by class. So obviously my topic is differential criminalization by class, and that is the contemporary issue. Why I think it's important is because the majority of the population is made up of the lower class, impoverished, and poor. We often face the hardest punishments and are arrested the most and are viewed as the ultimate danger. This is disproportionately unfair and mistreatment of the victimized. Lenses of analysis. To analyze this topic, I'm going to be looking at it through 4 different perspectives. The first is through the power structure analysis framework. This is how historical patterns persist in contemporary criminal justice systems. The second lens is media representation analysis. This is media representations don't reflect reality, but actively construct false social understandings of crime and poverty. The third lens is contemporary power structure analysis. This is recognizing how contemporary criminal justice systems systematically distort public perception of crime and danger. The fourth lens is resistance and transformation analysis. This is thinking strategically about transforming unjust systems. My analysis is rooted in themes of power, representation, and transformation. Regarding power, some of the questions that will be answered are: who has the power to change the system? Who in power is benefiting from the system? Who controls the image of the criminal/homeless/poor? Regarding representation, some of the questions that will be answered are: what is the representation in Khalifa? What is the representation in Raymond and Leighton? Regarding transformation, some of the questions that will be answered are: how has the classification of the dangerous class transformed over time? How has the perception of criminals transformed through time? Historical foundations. So, historical patterns of constructing the dangerous classes persist. Let's talk about the historical patterns of constructing dangerous classes persisting throughout time. The first significant point in time where dangerous classes and definitions were established was Sodom and Babylon / dangerous classes. The first one is around biblical times, and the second is around 1300 AD. So Sodom and Babylon are talked a lot about in the Bible, and it's mentioned how these two cities are evil and sinful and need to be destroyed, and it's full of a lot of poverty, and what was back then also considered homelessness. The rich and powerful were condemning these people when they were marginalized and victimized. The dangerous class was first talked about in around 1300 AD. This was what a lot of impoverished people were considered. The second major point in the dramatization is the dramatization of the Court of Miracles. This was around 1826 AD. The Court of Miracles always existed, and there were always poor people living in the area. And they were always doing the same activities, having the same mindset, etc. But around this time is when the dramatization happened, and the rich/powerful seek to benefit. So they called these people crazy, sinful, dangerous, etc. And that was how the public perception viewed them. The third major point is the development of the underworld. This was around 1912 AD. The underworld was referred to as a part of a set or two different groups. There was the overworld, or the regular world, where rational, powerful, rich people resided. Separate class of people lived in the underworld, who were the scourge of the earth, condemned, sinful, poor, homeless, etc., when they were really just the lower class. Throughout this time, the poor were committing just as many, if not fewer, crimes as the rich. The wealthy and powerful crimes were ignored and not even seen as crimes, even when they would be the same violation as a poor/homeless individual. This serves the rich/powerful because they can continue in their wrongdoings while pinning the blame on the poor or the homeless or the lower class. The rich need a scapegoat for all their excursions, and they found it in the poor marginalized groups. This demonstrates how the idea of poor being criminals and dangerous has existed throughout time. This is just more of a synthesis of what I've said and putting it all together. This demonstrates the continuation of contemporary patterns in the alienation, dehumanization of the poor. The ancient cities that were called evil and condemned. People rejoiced when all the civilians were killed. Gathering places of criminals was over-dramatized to make people afraid. Criminals is quote unquote. Two separate groups were formed, the overworld and the underworld. The underworld contained the most evil, dangerous people, or what society was led to believe were there. Media representation. The first piece of media that represents how the poor are criminalized is in the movie Aladdin. Jasmine was told to never go into the city because it's dangerous. When she goes, all she sees are poor people who are criminals and evil. She gets forcibly grabbed, thrown around, and is shown visibly disoriented by these criminals, who are just average citizens living in this country. This is a demonstration of how the homeless/poor are criminalized because it shows when Jasmine leaves the castle, all the people out there are just evil and trying to harm, the rich, powerful, innocent princess. Another example is of how the media portrays the poor as criminals is the show Undercover Boss. The CEO would come in one of their local small branches and pretend to be a new hire. It would always have a main worker who was considered evil, and the cameras would purposefully point out things and edit it in a certain way that they just seemed like a horrible, horrible person. And mean when they were really just working a minimum wage job, probably not paid enough, probably overworked. To distract from a very powerful individual coming in and firing somebody, they would cover it up by rewarding an employee who had a sob story and gave them a bunch of money, sometimes sent them to college for free, stuff like that. The problem in these examples, the SNL scandal and the Enron scandal, involves some form of control fraud. So these are modern representations, like happening within the last, this century, you could say. So executives would abuse their power to ignore certain rules that protected the financial stability of America, so that it would allow them for collective embezzlement. In the SNL scandal, Raymond and Leighton talk about how executives would sell fraudulent loans to their friends and family because it benefited them so much. They, on average, got around 36 months in jail, that's all, and some fines. They crippled the American economy and banking system for years. During the Enron scandal, executives encouraged their employees to continue to hold their stock and even buy more. During that time, the executives were selling all their shares. It lost 20,000 employees, all their jobs, and also a lot of their wealth. This demonstrates that even though the rich and powerful commit crimes on an insurmountably larger scale, they receive less punishment, their names are often redacted and hidden in documents, and there's minimal news coverage. This will continue to be analyzed further in a later lens. So, the perspectives that are centered and marginalized in media representation are very different. The centered perspective focuses on the rich and powerful and their existence among the lower class/poor/criminals. The marginalized perspective was the poor, homeless, whatever, low class, who are just trying to survive and they're criminalized for it. Contemporary power structures. So, next, I want to talk about how the power structures influence who is treated differently, specifically in the criminal justice system. This is a diagram that shows a difference between the poor and the rich and powerful. In the examples of the criminal justice system, to start, the common types of harm between the poor and the wealthy are that the poor commit more physical harm or immediate harm, while the wealthy commit more white-collar or covert crime. This is essentially an immediate threat versus a larger threat. Moving on to scale of harm, it's also different between these two. Poor offenders typically commit on a smaller scale. Normally, it's around one individual to a small group of individuals, whereas wealthy offenders commit on a much greater scale. An example of this would be wage theft, which could affect thousands of employees. This is essentially a large harm versus more extreme, even though covert harm. The next element is legal treatment. Typically, poor offenders are criminally prosecuted, whereas wealthy offenders are not. The cases are normally civil or regulatory matters for wealthy offenders. This is essentially the system treating street crimes, which affect fewer people and are on a smaller scale, more severely. Next, the typical punishment varies widely for poor offenders. They are normally arrested and given harsher sentences, whereas the wealthy rarely get prison and are normally facing fines. This is essentially the criminal justice system punishing the poor more severely, even though their crimes are just as severe or even less severe. Finally, the media coverage varies widely as well. Media coverage of a poor/homeless is what most commonly seen in the media, whereas corporate wealthy crimes are often not reported and hidden most of the time. This leads to the perception that the lower class, the poor, homeless, commit more crimes. This is an explanation of whose interests are served and who has benefited because of the status quo. The people whose interests are served are the rich because they are given free rein, while the poor are criminalized. This keeps the public perception that the poor are dangerous so that the wealthy and powerful continue to fly under the radar. Who has benefited and who is harmed? The rich and powerful benefit because they continue to be out of the spotlight, whereas the poor/homeless are criminalized, so they get fewer opportunities, are exposed to harsher treatments, etc. Resistance, transformation. These are the specific changes and transformations I recommend that would benefit our system the most. The first is that I would implement a SAC policy, which is known as the Swift and Certain policy. This is essentially a policy that ensures swift and certain punishment. For example, someone who commits a crime is quickly processed and given a certain sentence for time served, minimum. They have to serve time. The next policy is to remove the best judgment ruling. Right now, our judicial system is run by judges who are able to use their best judgment for sentencing, and it leads to subjective punishments and no uniformity. I also want to change the imbalance of power, giving less power to one group. Right now, we see the majority of power going to the wealthy and powerful people, and almost no power going to the homeless, the poor, the low class. And they make up a much larger population in our society. I also want a mandatory minimum prosecution. I want to ensure that every crime has a mandatory minimum sentence, which ties into the swift and certain policy. In tandem with this, I want civil settlements alongside sentences. I don't think settlements and fees are dissuading people enough from committing crimes. So if there is a fee/settlement, it will be accompanied by a sentence where they serve a certain amount of time. This is my analysis and development of the criminal justice system. For immediate reforms, I want the SAC policy, as stated before, mandatory minimum prosecution, and civil settlements alongside sentencing. For structural changes, I want a change of the imbalance of power and the removal of the best judgment ruling. That's kind of just a very brief synthesis of what I said in the last slide. Conclusion. Of all these connections from historical patterns to contemporary power structures inform my approach to change. The preferential treatment and power separation continue to happen and continue to be observed through the millennia. Our criminal justice system has become a tool for the powerful to use to continue to escape punishment themselves and harshly and unfairly punish the poor and powerless. That is why there needs to be a call for change. Our system, as it is right now, is built to keep the low low and it raises the high even higher. No longer can we continue to fear who we are told to fear. We have to see the objective illusion that is keeping the criminal justice system stagnant. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.